The snow blanketed everything in a thick, suffocating silence. The world felt frozen in time, swallowed by an endless white void. The wind howled across the plains, dragging ice particles through the air like tiny blades. Caleb tightened his fists inside worn leather gloves, eyes fixed on a shape in the distance. At first, he thought it was just another illusion, a trick of the cold and loneliness. But as he stepped closer, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a mirage. It was a child, curled up on the ground like a forgotten doll. She was seated beside an old, frost-covered wagon, its wheels half buried in the snow. Her blue coat was faded, dusted with ice, and her pink mittens looked worn from use. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She simply held a German shepherd puppy close to her chest, his muzzle tucked beneath her arm, trying to warm her with what little life he had left. The dog trembled violently, but his eyes stayed alert, watching Caleb with a cautious intensity. Caleb stopped a few feet away, frozen by more than just the cold. The wind carried a scent, burnt wood. His stomach tightened. Time seemed to stand still. He slowly dropped to one knee, the snow crunching beneath his weight. The silence was thick, broken only by distant creaks of frozen branches and the shallow breath of the girl. The puppy growled low, a warning, but didn't advance. There was something in Caleb the animal recognized, perhaps not fear, but grief. Caleb removed his gloves and held out a bare hand, not to touch, but to show peace. Their eyes met. Hers were wide, icy blue, and terrifyingly familiar. He had seen those eyes once before, in someone he'd buried deep inside his memory. Daughter. The word slipped out like a breath held in for years. He didn't plan to say it. It just came. The girl stared back, unblinking. The puppy shifted slightly in her lap, as if bracing for what might come next. The air grew colder, but Caleb felt heat rising in his chest, the kind that melts something long frozen. Could it really be her? No, it couldn't be. And yet, she was right there. She hugged the puppy tighter, her face unreadable. Then, for the first time, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, barely more than a whisper. Lupo. Caleb blinked. Is that his name? She nodded slowly, still without a smile, still guarded. But alive. Far off, at the edge of the snowfield, a lone wolf stood watching them. Still. Silent. Its eyes glowed with something ancient, not just instinct, but intention. Caleb saw it for only a moment, but deep in his gut, he knew. That creature hadn't come by accident. Something greater had led this girl to him. And though he wasn't ready, she had arrived. Caleb had lived alone for years in a small wooden cabin tucked into the edge of the northern woods, far from any town, far from anyone. Locals spoke of him in whispers, calling him the ghost farmer or the man the fire broke. Ever since that night, the night the fire took everything, he had become a shadow of who he once was. The flames had devoured his home, his peace, and, as everyone believed, his daughter. The search parties had found no remains, just ashes and silence. But Caleb never found peace in that silence. Something inside him refused to believe she was truly gone. Each morning since that night, he would rise before the sun, step onto the frozen porch, and look east, waiting, hoping, pretending he could feel her presence. Some days he heard her laughter in the wind. Other days, the pain was too heavy to bear. The only warmth in his life came from the stove's fire and memories that hurt more than they healed. He no longer prayed. He no longer asked why. He just existed, one day at a time. Until now. Now, sitting beside his fireplace, with the girl wrapped in blankets and Lupo curled at her feet, everything felt unreal. Caleb kept glancing at her, trying to understand. Her features were older, of course. She was no longer the toddler he remembered. But those eyes, those were Annabelle's eyes. He knew it. A father doesn't forget. Still, His heart fought between hope and fear. Could grief make a man see what he wanted to see? Or had some miracle unfolded right in front of him? Annabelle didn't say much. She sat quietly, holding a warm cup between her hands, eyes fixed on the flames. Caleb watched her with a mixture of awe and agony. He wanted to ask 100 questions, scream at the sky, fall to his knees in gratitude. But he knew she wasn't ready. She'd been through something long and hard. That kind of silence only came from survival. And survival always came with scars. Lupo stayed close to her, never leaving her side. The puppy seemed small for the journey he must have made, yet carried the air of something ancient. Caleb couldn't explain it, but Lupo felt like more than just a dog. There was a connection between him and the girl that went beyond companionship, something unspoken, instinctual. And Caleb noticed that, whenever Annabelle trembled, Lupo would lean against her. Not out of fear, but protection. Like he was born for this moment. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. The snow kept falling. And somewhere in the distance, hidden among the pines, the wolf stood again. Watching. Always watching. Caleb didn't know why, but deep down, he understood. This wasn't just a reunion. This was a return. And something had made it possible. Something wild, something silent, and something that would soon reveal its purpose. Caleb couldn't take his eyes off the pup. Lupo had the look of a dog, but there was something in his gaze that felt older, wiser, even wild. He wasn't just following Annabelle. He was guarding her, as if he understood the weight of her story before she even spoke a word. The way he positioned himself between her and any movement, the way his ears twitched at the slightest sound. It was more than instinct. It was purpose. Caleb had raised dogs his whole life. He knew their behavior. But Lupo was different. Almost trained by the forest itself. That night, as the fire crackled and the wind roared outside, Caleb sat across from the girl and her silent protector. Annabelle had eaten a little soup and now dozed lightly on the worn couch, wrapped in layers of wool. Lupo didn't sleep. He sat with his chin resting on her knee, his eyes never closing. Caleb leaned forward, whispering more to himself than anyone else. "Where did you come from, boy?" Lupo didn't react, but his ears twitched, and his gaze briefly shifted to the door, as if he knew what was still out there, watching. At sunrise, Caleb walked outside to fetch more firewood. The snow had stopped, but the sky was still gray and heavy. As he chopped the frozen logs, he glanced toward the tree lean. Just for a moment. And there it was, the wolf. Again. Standing perfectly still at the edge of the woods, half shrouded in mist. Caleb froze, the axe in his hand mid-air. The wolf didn't move. Just watched. It didn't growl, didn't show aggression. There was no threat, only presence. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. Back inside, Lupo was standing at the window, staring in the same direction. Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. The connection was undeniable. The wolf was no stranger. Somehow, he and Lupo were linked. He didn't know how, but he felt it in his gut. This dog had come from the forest, but not alone. He had been guided, trained, maybe, or even chosen. And he had found Annabelle. That couldn't be chance. Later that afternoon, as Caleb fed the fire again, Annabelle finally spoke more than a single word. Her voice was soft, but clear. "He followed me for days, first the wolf, then Lupo. The wolf never came close. Just watched. But one night, Lupo appeared. Like the wolf sent him to protect me." Caleb knelt beside her. "Why did you follow them?" She looked at him, eyes heavy with memory. "Because they were the only ones going the right way." Caleb sat back, stunned. He had no idea where she had come from or what she had endured. But one thing was becoming clear: Lupo wasn't just a dog who found a lost child. He was part of something bigger. Something that began long before that snowy day, and wasn't over yet. Caleb had stopped saying her name years ago. Not because he had forgotten it, but because it hurt too much to speak. Annabelle used to fill the house like sunlight, bouncing off walls in laughter, in bedtime stories, in whispered goodnights. But after the fire, the name became a ghost. He buried it with the tiny shoes they found near the ashes, with the pink ribbon that somehow survived the flames. Saying it aloud felt like calling out to someone who would never answer. But now, here she was, flesh and bone, older but unmistakable. The same eyes. The same quiet gaze. The name pulsed in his chest like a heartbeat he'd tried to ignore. He hadn't called her Annabelle yet. Not out loud. He wasn't sure if he had the right. She hadn't told him her name either. Not until now. As they sat by the fire that evening, Caleb turned to her, voice barely steady. I need to ask you something important." She looked at him, guarded but calm. "What's your name, sweetheart?" She hesitated, just for a moment. Then she whispered, "Annabelle." The word cracked through the room like lightning. Caleb dropped his gaze, fighting back the flood behind his eyes. He had imagined hearing that name again 1,000 times. In dreams, in nightmares, in the quietest moments of the night. But nothing could have prepared him for this. He exhaled, slowly. "I never forgot. Not for a single day." Annabelle didn't respond, but something shifted in her eyes. A softening. A recognition. Lupo, sensing the moment, laid his head on her lap and closed his eyes. Caleb watched the two of them, girl and dog, and felt something melt inside him that he thought had died. There were still questions, still wounds, but the name, her name, was the first thread stitching the broken pieces back together. He wanted to ask more, to dig into where she'd been, who had taken her, why she never came home. But he knew, if you rush a wounded animal, it runs. The same was true for children who had survived too much. That night, while Annabelle slept, Caleb stepped outside into the cold again. The sky had cleared. Stars stretched above the trees like frozen fireflies. He stood there in the silence, hoping for peace, and that's when he saw him again. The wolf. Standing between the trees, motionless, like a sentry. Caleb didn't move. The two locked eyes, and for a second, Caleb felt the weight of something beyond understanding. The wolf blinked slowly, then turned and vanished into the dark. Caleb whispered into the wind, "You brought her back, didn't you?" The forest didn't answer. But deep in his soul, something stirred. A truth unspoken, but undeniable. The name he never forgot had found its way back to him. Annabelle had seen the wolf before she ever met Lupo. That was the part Caleb still couldn't understand. How a child, lost, alone, in the freezing wild, survived long enough to be found. But Annabelle wasn't found. She had followed something. Something that appeared night after night, always just far enough to feel unreachable, yet close enough to give her hope. The wolf wasn't chasing her. It was leading her. She first saw it when the snow began to fall. She was cold, starving, and confused, walking through endless white with no direction. That's when the wolf emerged from the trees. Not running. Not hunting. Just standing there. Silent. Watching her. She thought she was hallucinating. But when she collapsed from exhaustion the first night, it stayed near. Not touching, not approaching, just watching from the shadows. When she woke the next morning, it was still there, footprints in the snow as proof she hadn't dreamed it. Every night after that, the wolf returned. And one morning, Lupo was there instead. Smaller, gentle, familiar in a way she couldn't explain. It was as if the wild wolf had chosen a messenger, a younger version of itself, and passed the mission on. From that point on, Lupo never left her side. Through frozen rivers, thick snow, and endless days, the pup stayed close, guiding her like he'd been trained for it. But who trained him? How did he find her? Caleb asked himself those questions constantly, but there were no logical answers. Just instincts and mysteries. Caleb sat across from her now, watching her face as she spoke in quiet, slow words. She was remembering, reliving. Every time she mentioned the wolf, her tone changed, not afraid, not sad. Respectful. Like she was talking about someone who had saved her life. Caleb had always believed that if he ever saw his daughter again, there'd be stories of people involved. Towns. Adults. But not this. Not a wolf. Not something ancient and wild. Do you think he's still watching? Caleb asked softly. Annabelle nodded without hesitation. He never really left. He stayed just far enough, but he always knew where I was. She looked out the window, eyes lost in the dark forest. And I think he brought me to you. On purpose. That night, as the fire flickered low and Lupo snored softly by the door, Caleb stood once again at the edge of his porch. The cold bit his skin, but he didn't flinch. There, between the trees, stood the wolf, like a statue, barely visible in the moonlight. They stared at each other for what felt like hours. Caleb felt something deep in his chest. Not fear. Not wonder. Gratitude. No one would ever believe him. But he knew. This wasn't just an animal. It was a guide. A protector. A promise kept by something beyond understanding. And whatever it was, it had brought Annabelle home. The cabin hadn't changed much over the years, but to Caleb, it had never felt more unfamiliar. Everything inside was a memory. The floorboards that once echoed with tiny footsteps, the old chair where bedtime stories were told, the window where she used to press her face and watch the snow fall. When Annabelle crossed the threshold, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. She looked around slowly, not speaking, just absorbing. Caleb watched from behind, afraid to disturb the moment. This was no longer just a house. It was a ghost he had lived inside. Annabelle ran her fingers along the edges of the table. She paused at the fireplace, where a faded photograph still sat, the only one he hadn't hidden away. It showed a younger Caleb, smiling beside a woman with soft eyes and a little girl in her lap. Annabelle stared at it for a long time. Caleb stepped forward, unsure of what to say. But she broke the silence first. "That's her, isn't it?" He nodded slowly. "Your mother. She loved you more than anything." The walls seemed to answer her silence with creaks and sighs, the cabin settling in the cold. Every corner of that home had once been filled with warmth, with life. Now it had become a museum of pain. But with Annabelle's return, something was shifting. As she moved through the rooms, touching old toys, folded blankets, and forgotten books, it was as if she was stitching her presence back into the very wood. The air felt lighter, the fire burned brighter. Even Lupo wagged his tail, sensing something healing. Caleb prepared a small meal while Annabelle rested by the fire with Lupo. He caught himself humming, something he hadn't done in years, a lullaby he used to sing when she was just a baby. The melody drifted through the cabin like a breeze, and to his surprise, Annabelle began to hum along softly. She remembered. And in that quiet exchange, father and daughter began to rebuild a bond time had tried to sever. No words were needed. The song carried all the weight their hearts couldn't speak. Outside, snow began to fall again, gently this time, not a storm, but a blanket. The kind that covers everything in silence and peace. Caleb looked through the frosted window. No sign of the wolf tonight. But he didn't need to see it to know it was there. Somewhere in the dark, watching, waiting, protecting. Its role wasn't finished yet. Inside the cabin, Annabelle curled up beside Lupo, wrapped in layers of warmth that were more than just blankets. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt alive. Caleb sat in the old chair, eyes on the fire, and let himself believe. Maybe, just maybe, the past hadn't been lost. It had only been waiting to come home. The fire had come without warning, in the dead of night. Caleb remembered the way the flames moved, alive, angry, devouring everything in their path. He had woken to the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling wood, but by the time he reached Annabelle's room, it was already too late. Or so he believed. The doorway had been swallowed by fire. He screamed her name again and again, as the heat pushed him back. That was the last time he spoke it for years, a cry lost in the roar of destruction. In the days that followed, the world became a blur of ash, silence, and guilt. The firefighters never found her body, but they told him it wasn't unusual in fires that intense. The heat could erase everything. Caleb refused to accept that. He searched the ruins until his hands bled, until his voice was gone, until there was nothing left but charred wood and unbearable emptiness. Eventually, the town moved on. They called it a tragedy. They said it was fate. But Caleb didn't believe in fate. Only loss. He left the town behind and rebuilt the cabin alone, in silence. Not as an act of healing, but survival. Every wall he raised was a monument to grief. Every board nailed in place was another reminder of what had been taken. He couldn't bring himself to rebuild Annabelle's room. That door stayed closed, untouched, like a sealed tomb. He couldn't bear the idea of erasing what little memory remained inside. Now, years later, sitting beside the girl who was supposed to be lost forever, the fire returned, not in flames, but in memory. He saw it behind his eyes every time she moved, every time she spoke. He saw her tiny hands reaching through smoke. He heard his own screams bouncing off the burning walls. He had carried that moment with him every single day, the second he lost her. And yet, here she was. Annabelle didn't remember the fire the same way. She remembered waking up to heat and confusion, to voices she didn't know, to being lifted into strange arms and taken far away. She remembered crying for her father. She remembered waiting. But no one ever came back. They told her the house was gone, that her father had died in the flames. And after a while, she believed them. Until the wolf appeared. Caleb listened in silence, jaw tight, hands clenched. He wasn't angry at her, only at the world that took her, at the people who lied, at the fire that broke everything. And yet, in this moment, the fire was also something else. It had taken her, yes. But somehow, impossibly, it had also carried her to a different path. A path that led her back to him. And deep down, Caleb realized the truth. The fire may have destroyed everything he knew, but it hadn't destroyed everything he had. Annabelle sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting gently on Lupo's fur. The light from the fire flickered across her face, revealing something more than just tiredness, a weight that didn't belong to a child. Caleb watched her carefully, sensing she was holding something back. All this time, she had said little about what happened after the fire. Where she went. Who took her? But tonight, her silence broke. And with it came the truth that Caleb wasn't ready to hear. "They told me you were gone," she said softly. "That the fire had taken everything, even you." Her voice didn't tremble, but there was pain beneath it. "At first, I didn't believe them. I screamed for you. I waited. But days passed, then weeks, and no one came. So I stopped asking." Caleb lowered his head, his chest tightening with every word. She hadn't been lost. She had been taken. Not by the fire, but by people who had no right. "They?" he asked. The word barely made it past his lips. She nodded. They found me outside. People I didn't know. They lived near the edge of the woods. They said it wasn't safe to go back. That everything was gone. That you didn't survive. She looked up at him, her eyes searching. They said if I tried to leave, I'd die out there too. So I stayed. 4 years. Caleb felt a sharp sting behind his eyes, the kind that comes from helplessness mixed with rage. While he mourned her, while he built a life on sorrow, she had been alive, believing he was dead. Lupo let out a soft whine and nestled closer to her. It was clear he had arrived when she needed him most. A turning point. A signal. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper. The wolf came first. I saw him at night, standing on the ridge. Just watching. 4 weeks. I didn't know why. But he made me feel safe. Like someone knew where I was. Like someone remembered me. And then one night, I followed him. That choice, to follow the wolf, had changed everything. It led her away from the people who fed her lies. It pulled her back through the wilderness, through fear and uncertainty, toward something she couldn't explain but trusted anyway. Caleb realized then, the fire didn't take his daughter, the lie did. A lie carefully placed, nurtured by fear, and sealed by isolation. And yet, it hadn't held her forever. Something deeper had broken through. As the fire crackled behind them, Caleb leaned forward and gently took her hand. You were never forgotten, he said. Not for a second. Annabelle looked at him, and this time, her eyes didn't carry just pain, they carried recognition. And trust. A lie had stolen her past, but something wild, loyal, and silent had given her the strength to find the truth. The sky had turned a deep gray, thick with clouds that threatened another storm. Caleb stepped outside just as the first snowflakes began to fall, silent and slow, like tiny pieces of time returning to the earth. Behind him, Annabelle stood in the doorway, wrapped in her coat, with Lupo at her side. This time, she wasn't afraid of the cold. She wasn't afraid of anything. She had walked through fire, lies, and wilderness. And now, she stood on solid ground. Home. They walked together through the snow-covered field behind the cabin, their footprints forming a trail where none had existed for years. Caleb didn't speak. Neither did she. Words weren't needed. The silence between them was no longer filled with grief. It was filled with understanding. Lupo trotted ahead, stopping now and then to glance back, as if guiding them. Not far off, beyond the trees, a pair of glowing eyes watched in stillness. The wolf had returned once more. Caleb carried something in his coat pocket, a small wooden carving, weathered by time. He had made it years ago, a tiny figure of a girl with braids, holding a flower. It was supposed to be a gift. He never got the chance to give it. As they reached the base of a tall pine tree, the one that had stood unchanged since Annabelle's birth, Caleb knelt in the snow and began to clear a small patch of earth. Gently, he placed the carving in the ground, covering it with a smooth stone. Annabelle watched in silence. She didn't ask questions. She seemed to know what it meant. Caleb looked up at her, eyes glassy. "This is my promise," he said, "that I'll never lose you again. Not to fire. Not to lies. Not to anything." Annabelle stepped closer and placed her hand on his shoulder. Lupo sat beside them, tail brushing the snow, quiet and calm. And just beyond the tree line, the wolf stood sentinel, silent but ever present. As the snow fell thicker, Caleb took off his glove and held out his hand to Annabelle. She took it without hesitation. Their fingers locked, not just in warmth, but in something far deeper, a bond reforged in pain, survival, and love. The past could never be erased, but it could be honored. And the future, it was now something they would face together. Before returning to the cabin, Caleb turned one last time to the forest. The wolf was still there, standing like a monument carved from the wild. Their eyes met across the distance. Caleb gave a small nod, a gesture of respect. Of thanks. The wolf blinked slowly, then turned and vanished into the trees, leaving no trace in the snow. But Caleb knew. That moment, that place, that promise, it had been seen. And it had been sealed. The days grew quieter after that morning beneath the pine tree. Caleb and Annabelle settled into a rhythm, not fast, not loud, but steady, healing. The cabin, once filled with ghosts, now echoed with new life. Caleb repaired the broken shelves, cleaned the soot-stained walls, and, for the first time in years, reopened the door to Annabelle's old room. She stood in the doorway, hesitant, then crossed the threshold. The room smelled of cedar and memories. The toys were still there, faded, but waiting, like everything else in that house had been. Lupo had grown stronger. His small body, once thin from the journey, now pulsed with energy. He followed Annabelle everywhere, her guardian in every sense of the word. At night, he slept by her bed. By day, he ran ahead in the snow, barking at the wind like he was challenging it to try anything. Caleb would watch them through the window, a quiet smile forming on his face. Not all scars could be seen, but some began to fade under the warmth of what was real. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Annabelle asked the question they both knew would come. "Do you think we'll see him again?" She didn't say the name. She didn't have to. Caleb looked toward the forest, where the shadows stretched long and silent. "I think, when it's time," he answered. "He'll know." And as if summoned by the weight of that moment, a howl rose in the distance. Long, low, final. They both froze, eyes turned to the trees. It wasn't just a sound. It was a farewell. The howl wasn't one of pain, or warning, or hunger. It was something else, a call made when a task is complete. Caleb felt it deep in his chest, like a drumbeat that echoed across his bones. Annabelle pressed her hand to her heart. Even Lupo sat upright, ears perked, eyes focused on the horizon. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just listened. And then, as if understanding, he laid down beside Annabelle and closed his eyes. That night, they didn't speak much. The fire burned steady. The wind was calm. Caleb sat in his old chair, Annabelle wrapped in blankets nearby, and Lupo curled up between them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and endless. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, the wolf walked alone, not lost, not searching, simply returning to the silence he came from. Caleb closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. The past no longer screamed. The house no longer mourned. Annabelle was home. And whatever force had watched over them, wild, loyal, ancient, had done its part. The howl was not just a goodbye. It was a blessing. A promise passed from one guardian to another. And now, the rest was up to them.